Okay, so the last time we were in a lecture, we talked about the stuff that was in the lecture notes, right? I think it's just the first 2 pages of the lecture notes that talk about what the reproductive organ is, what the gametes are, what diploid versus haploid is, what the SRY gene is, and I think we stopped right at the Wolffian and the Mullerian ducts. So that's all you need to know in the lecture notes. Then you can flip over to the handout I put online in the last folder. And in lab this week, if you've already had lab yesterday or Tuesday, we talked about all the boy junk. So we talked about the feedback loops for testosterone. It works exactly the same way as we've seen all the other feedback loops that are controlled by the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary releases FSH and LH. FSH makes what? It goes to the testis and increases the production of little fish, right? The sperm. When you make the sperm doesn't travel in the blood. The sperm, of course, we know where that comes from. When you release a chemical, or when you make a sperm, you release a chemical called inhibin at the same time. So if you make 1 billion sperm, you make 1 billion of these inhibins. The inhibin's a hormone, so how does it get around? In the blood. It goes in the blood and comes back up here and shuts off this feedback loop. So this is kind of a different pathway of the normal feedback loop that we've seen. This makes some physiological structure, the sperm, but it also releases inhibin that comes back and shuts off the feedback loop. And then over here, we talked about this in the lab, or we will talk about in the lab, the different purposes for testosterone. How much testosterone does a little boy have when he's 5? None. Before birth, he has testosterone, and then about what age does testosterone come back? About 13 or 14, right? When he hits what? Puberty. We talk about erection physiology in lab and how it works. We talk about erection dysfunctions, and don't forget on this exam, you need to know dysfunctions. So somebody was asking earlier a question about the disorders that we have for case studies this week in lab. Those case studies are on the final exam, but I talk about every one of those diseases in the lectures, so you only have to know the extent that I talk about them in the lecture. So if a case study is presented in lab and it's more detailed than what I talked about in lecture, you don't need to know that stuff, not for the last exam. But what I talk about in class, like when I talk about, trying to think, what was the first one I talked about? Panhypopituitarism. I talked about that in class. That's also one of the options for a case study, so you have to know it. What is panhypopituitarism? Pan means all, hypo, lower or less, and pituitary is telling you all of the anterior pituitary hormones are decreased. What were the 6 anterior pituitary hormones? I'm hoping that you all say the first one. Follicle stimulating hormone, so there's the F. Luteinizing hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. I'm trying to hope you go in the order. What order am I trying to tell you? F, L, A, T. Yep, thyroid stimulating hormone. P is prolactin, and G is growth hormone, flat pig. All of those, and the reason I tell you that, to remember those, is because all of those follow this feedback loop. They're all from the anterior pituitary, so they all follow the same pathway. Hypothalamus. I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. The hypothalamus releases a hormone that tells the anterior pituitary what to do. The anterior pituitary releases it and goes to the target organ, which releases another hormone to do some physiological effect, typically. Okay. The second page, if you put these off and they're back to back, it opens like a little booklet, so you can compare male and female anatomical structures and pathway. When you're looking at the male anatomy, the way I remembered it when I was learning anatomy and the way I remembered it for physiology is that we're talking about reproduction. The whole goal is to make the gamete and then release the gamete and have it follow this pathway. So where's the sperm made? In the seminiferous tubules of the testes, right? So the seminiferous tubules, then they go to the, what's this little worm-like structure on the top of the testis? Epididymis. What happens in there? They mature. Yep. And then when he's ready to release the sperm for ejaculation, what's the name of this long tube that comes up over the bladder, behind the bladder, and then down? The vas deferens. Yep. So it goes up the vas deferens. This is during intercourse. It comes over, goes into the prostate gland, and the prostate releases chemicals that are alkaline. Why alkaline? Why is it releasing a fluid, a milky fluid that's full of alkaline substance? Because where's the sperm about to be released to? The vagina. I said that once in one class, and I heard a guy from the back go, "A Kleenex." And so now I'm keeping my fingers crossed that people give me the right answer. I don't know how acidic a Kleenex is. I have no clue. But right, the vagina is a very acidic environment, so it's releasing the alkaline material to help neutralize the environment, so it protects the sperm. And then this little structure here is a seminal vesicle, and it's releasing seminal fluid. If a guy has a vasectomy, they cut this, they cauterize it or stitch it so that the sperm can't get through, but he can still have an ejaculation. He can still release fluid, but there's no sperm in it. So it's not really semen, it's just seminal fluid. And then the bulbar urethra is the other gland, and the bulbar urethra helps lubricate and clear out the urethra before intercourse. And then during ejaculation, if you've already been in lab, what part of the nervous system turns on erection and causes that arousal response? Parasympathetic. Think rest and digest. When you're resting and relaxing, that's when you're more ready to have sex. So rest and digest system, the parasympathetic causes erection, but then when he's ready to release, it switches to what? Sympathetic. Heart rate goes up, breathing goes up, all the muscles down at the base of the penis, all the muscles along the vas deferens, all of them tense all of a sudden, and it propels the sperm out. Right? And then goes through the urethra and out the penis. So if you look at the order, starting at the seminiferous tubules, you go S, E, V, E, shift the nervous system, N, and then U, P, 7 up. It tells you the pathway. You have to know the structure of the sperm and what each of these structures do, and if you've watched the video already, John Lithgow kind of narrates that and tells you what they're for. I told you this last week. The stem cell, the spermatogonia, which is going to be a sperm, that's a diploid cell. But what's the goal for the actual spermatozoa, the sperm cell? Is to become what? Haploid, 23 chromosomes. Why only 23 when the body needs 46? Right, because it needs to meet up with an egg that has the other half. So now we're going to start talking about the female parts and then reproduction. So like I said, if you printed these off, if you're looking at them, you see the male on one side and you see the female over on the other side, and you can compare. The pathways are very similar because, well, they're exactly similar. The reproductive gonad, whether you're a male or female, before 2 weeks of age is exactly the same. So if there's SRY gene, you become a what? The gonads develop into testes, and if there's no SRY gene, they become ovaries. So they're the same structures. When you look at the pathway, it's very similar. I'm going to jump right to the pathway. So there's the gonad. What's this gonad? The ovary. Yep. It releases the egg. The egg goes up into, what's this long tube called? The fallopian tube, or the oviduct is another name for it. Anybody know the name of these little finger-like projections out here? Fimbriae. Yep. So the fimbriae, when you release an egg, it dumps into your abdominal cavity. The fimbriae are like little hands that are trying to pull the egg towards them. It's almost like you dump you put a rubber ducky in a tub and you can't reach the rubber ducky, so what do you do to get the duck? You kind of pull the water and create a current. That's what the fimbriae are doing. They kind of create a current so that the egg comes up and into this funnel-like section of the fallopian tube. Once it's in there, there are little tiny finger-like structures called cilia, and the cilia carry the egg, because the egg's not motile. It doesn't have a flagella like a sperm. So the egg gets carried hand over hand by the cilia, almost like it's as if it's bacteria, and it gets moved all the way down here to the ampulla, and ideally in the ampulla is where fertilization takes place. Is that where you want pregnancy? No. Fertilization and pregnancy are two different things. Fertilization is when you have an egg meet a sperm, and they combine. Pregnancy is actually the development of that new structure. So the cilia, and I always think, I don't know if I gave you the example. Did I give you the Pearl Jam example? Great. So it's like crowd surfing. The egg is just carried across the top from one hand to the next until it meets up with the sperm. And the sperm does the same thing. By the time it gets in here, it's been traveling for usually about 2 days. So it's a long trip swimming its way up here. When it gets up here, it's getting tired. So the cilia actually move it along to meet with the egg. So the egg's coming one way, the sperm's coming the other. And the cilia also scrape across the sperm and start removing that protective coating. So that when it meets up with the egg, it's all ready to fertilize an egg. All right, so I'll go back here. Same thing. Remember the pathway. The egg goes into the fallopian tube. It comes into what's this big pear-shaped structure? The uterus. If it's fertilized, what should happen there? Implantation. It should stick to the wall. If it's not fertilized, it just passes through and during the menstrual cycle is shed out with the rest of the uterine lining. And then what do they call this little hole at the bottom of the uterus? Cervix, and then through the vaginal canal and out. So just remember the pathway. Once you release an egg, the pathway getting all the way through here. If something changes, like fertilization, Then it's going to make a pit stop in the uterus, and it's going to take 9 months before it actually moves to the cervix and out the vaginal canal. Okay, so when we're looking at the structures, the ovaries, of course, are the gonads. The ovarian follicle is where the egg's developing. When a woman's born, she already has all of her follicles and all of her eggs set in the ovary. She doesn't make any more. When does a boy start making sperm? Not until about 13 or 14 years after he's born. So his stem cells are sitting there, but they haven't actually produced sperm yet. All of her eggs are already there. They're frozen in time until, whenever, 11 years old, all the way up to about 50 years old. What happens around 50? Menopause, when she stops releasing eggs. All right, so all those eggs are stuck. They're actually stuck in a phase called meiosis. So they're stuck there, and they don't do anything. They start replicating, they start splitting apart, but then they freeze. And when she's born, they're stuck in that frozen stage for, whatever, like I said, 13 to 50 years. And that's why women over the age of 35 have a higher risk of what? Delivering a child that has Down syndrome, because those eggs have been stuck in this phase for 35 years. Every time she's zapped with x-rays that hit around the egg, they can damage the eggs. Every time that she smokes a cigarette and introduces toxins to her body, anytime she eats things that have carcinogens or mutagens in it, she damages her body. So it's been taking all kinds of DNA damage, and if that egg has flaws, then when it gets fertilized, it can carry the flaws onto the baby. What's actually really interesting, and it's fascinating, is that when I was in school, they were saying that only about 1 in every 3 fertilizations actually results in pregnancy. So that means that by the time a woman gets pregnant once, the odds are that she had 2 fertilized eggs before that. And I was watching a video, actually I heard about this last year on Dr. Radio on XM, but they said it's more likely 5. So 1 in 5 actual fertilizations result in a live birth. So there's spontaneous abortions, there's stillbirth, or there's when she didn't even realize she was pregnant, and before the menstrual cycle happened, the egg was rejected, or the fertilized egg was rejected. So a lot of things can happen on the way through there. Okay, oogenesis is the process of developing the oocyte, which is going to be an ova, which is a what? An egg. Yep. So spermatogenesis develops the sperm, and oogenesis develops the oocyte, which is the egg. All right, let's see. So where are we at? Oh, I already talked about some of this. As it's developing while she's an embryo, this is when it starts changing, but then it gets stuck in meiosis 1, and it stays there until menarche, which is what? Her first period. Yep. And then from that point on, she'll release an egg once a month until she's about 50, roughly. Right? Ovulation, by the way, is a split moment in time. When you hear about somebody ovulating, that's a doctor's term for saying it's about this time. Within this day or that day, it's ovulation. But the actual ovulation we're talking about is a split second. It's when the egg's developing and then it's released. Boop, it gets launched. It makes that sound too. So if you listen real close, there it was. I believe I'm ovulating, right? So every month, and this is actually changed. I was watching a reproductive video about fertility issues a couple days ago, and the fertility doctor was saying a number different than this, but about 6 to 12 eggs are actually developed every month. How many should be released? 1. And that doctor was saying that it's actually closer to 10 to 20 eggs every month are developed. So when you look at the ovary itself, the eggs start developing, they start enlarging, and this is kind of cool, and I didn't know this before, but as they enlarge, they actually have chemicals that try and kill the neighboring ones. So one of these has more chemicals to kill the neighbors, and what it's trying to do is kill the neighbor and eat its food. So as they're enlarging, you start with 10 of them, and then you're down to 9, and then 8, and it just keeps shrinking. As one gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's killing off its neighbors. So every month, she actually develops about 20 eggs. About 10 here, about 10 here, but only 1 can be released, the one that's the best or the, I guess, fittest to be released. So as it's developing, we call this follicle, or the thing around the egg. The egg itself doesn't grow. The egg is set in its size, but the follicle around it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And right before ovulation, the follicle gets up to about 2 centimeters, which is about the width of your thumb, so it can get pretty big. So if you're looking to see if there's a follicle developing, they could actually see it. They may even be able to see it on an ultrasound if they look well. Look good, look something, if they look right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the next stages. So here's a close-up of an ovary, and here you can see that bundle of cells that are developing, this bundle of eggs. As the eggs are developing, they become a follicle. Guess what hormone stimulates the follicle to develop like this? Follicle-stimulating hormone. So if you remember, instead of remember the initials FSH, if you remember what it means, it tells you exactly what it does. If it's stimulating the follicle to release an egg in a female, what's it do for a male? the exact same thing, but with the male gamete, which is a sperm. So it develops the sperm. So you're developing this follicle, and it's called the primary follicle. And as it's developing, you can see it starts filling with a fluid, and it's called antral fluid. And this thing keeps filling and filling and filling and filling, almost like a water balloon. And when it gets really, really big, what usually happens to a water balloon? Boop. Right. Keep using that sound. I should change it. So it gets big enough that it pops. This thing will keep growing. There's actually an enzyme that's necessary. Right around day 14 of her cycle, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, around day 14 an enzyme comes out, and the enzyme eats a hole in the wall of it. If that enzyme's not present, this thing will keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in my patho class, I actually found a picture of a one that had a 15-pound follicle. So it kept developing and developing and developing. What was interesting is that she quit menstruating because her body kept thinking, well, this thing's going to pop anytime, so it didn't allow her to have a menstrual cycle. And she thought she went into menopause early, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, she thought she was getting fatter because it was starting to push out in her abdomen, and then it started compressing on different organs, and they looked and went, oh my gosh, look at this thing. It was huge. 15 pounds. That's gigantic. So every month, one of these should develop, and hopefully on day 14, what happens? I just mentioned it. Ovulation, and it kicks it out. That's the third sound effect. Okay, so there's day 14. You can see this egg is basically like a little volcanic explosion. All that water built up behind it pops and gushes it out. And it blasts the egg out. Where's the egg at right now? Is it in the fallopian tube? It's in her abdomen. Is it possible for it to get fertilized out here? Yes. If the sperm made it all the way up here and the sperm was waiting and it fertilized it here, it could actually implant in her small intestine, her large intestine, anywhere in the abdominal cavity. Is that going to be a successful pregnancy? No. So that's one that they would actually have to go in and take out. I heard a couple years ago about one that managed to get all the way back and it implanted right next to the vertebra and it dug into her spinal cord. So ideally what's happening is that egg, once it's released here, it has all this fluid around it. The fimbriae kind of bring it in, they pull it up and into the fallopian tube. And then, of course, I've already talked about this, it crowd surfs its way down. What are the things that are crowd surfing on? Cilia. Yeah, the cilia are waving. So right around day 14, these cilia start going crazy and they're waving too. And they're trying to pull all the sperm and the egg together. Okay. The ovary's not done yet. So these are the first 14 days developing that egg, and then the egg's gone, but that follicle is not finished. Now suddenly that follicle will start puffing up. It starts collecting cholesterol to make hormones. What kind of hormones will it make? What class of hormones will it make? Cholesterol. Steroids. It's making steroid hormones. So it's collecting all these steroids to puff up full of hormones. What are the two hormones you think it's going to make in a woman? Steroids. Estrogen and progesterone. So this follicle has actually been producing estrogen the whole time. Now it's going to still make estrogen, but it's going to start cranking out something she hasn't seen for the last 14 days, progesterone. Progesterone spikes around day 14, building up for the next few days, and then it's going to drop off if she doesn't have fertilization. But it's this thing, and it's called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body. It's yellow because it's full of that fatty cholesterol. And it puffs up and puffs up and puffs up. And if she hasn't had fertilization by around day 21 of her cycle, if there's no fertilization that happens, this thing will shrivel up into a little scar, and it's called atresia. But the scar itself, the process is called atresia. The scar itself is called the corpus albicans. Albicans means white. Why would they call it that? You ever seen a scar? What color are scars? They're like a pale color, right? More of a white color. So the two terms you have to know here, corpus luteum is when it's full of steroids and it's making progesterone and some estrogen. The corpus albicans is when it comes to scar tissue and it shrivels up. Atresia is that process. So this is what's happening at the ovary itself. Once it's released, remember the pathway, the fallopian tube. If there's no fertilization, it goes into the uterus, goes to the cervix, out the vaginal canal, and it leaves at the body. If it's fertilized, about 1 in 5 of those will stick in the uterus, and then that's where we start on 2 pages from now. So the first thing you want to remember is the pathway coming out of the body if there's no fertilization. All right, now we get to talk about female hormones. Remember how long the page was for the male hormones? It was like the top third of the page. We have the next 2 pages to talk about female hormones. So glad I wake up in the morning, hit the floor, and go, My man, testosterone. That's it. Now we're going to talk about estrogen, progesterone. We're going to talk about LH and FSH again, and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So the top part of the cycle looks exactly like a man's cycle. You have GnRH coming from the hypothalamus. You have FSH that's being stimulated to release. FSH goes down to what organ in the female? The ovary. But it doesn't make sperm. It makes, or I shouldn't say makes, it develops the egg. So if you remember that develops sperm in men, obviously the egg's the equivalent in women. So FSH comes down here and starts developing the follicle to develop the egg. Luteinizing hormone comes down here and just adds to it. So these two hormones work together. They're basically thickening that follicle, making it more plump and plump and plump. Supporting the egg, feeding the egg, nurturing the egg, and allowing the egg to start shifting through the rest of that meiosis process. So now it's developing. Right. The whole time that she's doing that, that follicle is releasing estrogen. So estrogen comes out, and this is kind of the tricky part about estrogen. Estrogen comes out, and it's going to go up to the hypothalamus, and as her estrogen levels rise, what's it going to start telling the hypothalamus? Stop making estrogen. Does she want to stop releasing this follicle-stimulating hormone right when she started developing the follicle? No. So this is where it gets tricky. Remember, I told you 2 times this semester you're going to have to remember what kind of a feedback loop. Positive. So this is where it gets tricky. Like I said, the estrogen's made and goes up and tells the hypothalamus, we don't need so much. Right around day 10 or 11, it's going to shut off the hypothalamus, but the estrogen's actually going to get stuck in a positive feedback loop, and it's going to come back and increase the production of its own estrogen. So see this little tiny loop here? Estrogen's released, estrogen goes up and shuts off the anterior pituitary in the hypothalamus. I'll go up a little bit. In the hypothalamus. But look at this little pathway. It's coming right back to the ovary and telling the ovary to do what? What's the plus mean? Turn it up. It's going to tell it turn it up. And if you printed these pages out so they were side by side, you'll actually see this next page right next to it. So if you look over at the right-hand side, you can see her levels of hormone through the month. Here's her FSH and LH that start rising in the beginning, but look at FSH. When estrogen gets in that positive feedback loop, FSH actually starts dropping down a little bit. LH is a little bit tricky. Look at LH rise until about day 14. Look at what LH does right at day 14. LH spikes enormously. Guess what LH does at day 14? It makes her ovulate. If you think estrogen makes her ovulate, you're wrong. It's LH. Luteinizing hormones what actually causes ovulation. Because look at estrogen. Watch the estrogen. It's slowly rising, slowly rising, slowly rising. It's in that feedback loop where it doesn't really change that much until about day 10. And then it's into a positive feedback loop. When it gets stuck in a positive feedback loop, look what happens to estrogen. It starts skyrocketing. It grows really, really, really quick until about day 13, and then it peaks right about day 13. At day 13, this surge of estrogen actually causes LH to pop out. It's almost like it blows a fuse in the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can't control the LH anymore. So LH surges, but look at estrogen. On day 14, what happened to her estrogen level? It plummeted. Estrogen is not responsible for ovulation. LH is responsible for ovulation. Have I said it 3 times yet? Wink, wink. I love when I say something like that, everybody's head goes down with the pencil. He said wink, wink. So watch the hormones and watch the cycle. I love this picture. This is almost like that cardiovascular cycle picture that can be a little overwhelming sometimes, but just pick one part of it. Do you want to look at FSH and LH? Where are these two released from? Anterior pituitary. Or do you want to look at the ovary, which controls estrogen and progesterone? By the way, look at progesterone for the first 14 days. What do you notice about it? Practically nothing. And then around day 14, what happened right here? Ovulation, and look at progesterone. Spiking really quick. It spikes really high, and then about day 21, roughly, it starts plummeting. And I'll talk about what happens when it plummets. But estrogen spikes around day 13, and then estrogen never gets as high as it was before. So estrogen will come back a little bit, but not as powerfully as it was before. So you can look at the anterior pituitary's functions, you can look at the ovary's functions, you can actually look at the ovary growth in this picture too. Here you have that primary follicle getting a little bit thicker, thicker, thicker. Look at the egg, the little blue dot in there. Is the egg growing in size? Nope. It's just the follicle that's changing size. The egg is almost like a chicken egg. It's in a capsule so it can't grow any bigger. It's stuck. And that's kind of a theme you'll notice. Even when it's fertilized, it doesn't grow any bigger. The shell around the egg, once it has a sperm inside of it, doesn't get any bigger. It's like a chicken. The chicken can grow inside of it, but does the egg grow? The egg's fixed. Until the chicken becomes too big and it can't stay in the egg, then what happens? It bursts out, and we'll talk about that too. So first 14 days, you can see this egg is, well, the follicle is growing, the egg's getting primed, and then the LH surge right up here causes ovulation. So there are 4 times. There's really no reason for you not to remember that. So ovulation happens. There's a little boop. It's bursted out, goes up into the fallopian tube, and it's trying to be fertilized. What happens to that follicle? Does it shrivel up and die? Not yet. It starts collecting what? Cholesterol. And it gives that yellow appearance, which they call it the what? Corpus luteum, the yellow body. It's like Corpus Christi. What's that actually mean? The body of Christ. So corpus is referring to the body. Corpus luteum, luteum is referring to yellow. Albicans is referring to what color does it eventually become? White. Yep. So the next several days after ovulation, this thing's big and puffy, full of steroids. It's releasing what primarily? Progesterone with a little bit of estrogen. Progesterone spikes right after ovulation. While she's waiting for this egg to be fertilized, do you think she wants to start developing another egg that could be released? She doesn't know yet if this egg's fertilized. What would happen if she just kept releasing eggs after that? She might have one that's fertilized today, another one's fertilized 10 days from now, another one's fertilized maybe another 7 days. So she may have like this random number of babies growing inside of her. Her body focuses on one egg, and until the cycle is completely over 28 days later, she doesn't release another one. It doesn't happen. So as long as progesterone's out and in high levels, it's telling her hypothalamus, there's an egg released, it's potentially going to be fertilized, do what? Increase your activity and release another egg, or stop working for a while. It's telling her stop working. Why this is significant is because the birth control pill has high levels of progesterone and lower levels of estrogen. It mimics this part of her cycle. So if she takes it back here, what's it telling the hypothalamus? It's lying to the hypothalamus. That pill is actually telling her hypothalamus, an egg's been released. Has an egg been released? No. So it's telling her that an egg's been released. Don't do anything. Don't release an egg. Don't fertilize the egg. Don't prep the egg. Don't prime it. Don't release FSH and LH. And then she takes that pill all the way up until about this week, which is the 3rd week of her cycle, and then what's she do? She stops taking it. And then her levels of progesterone and estrogen drop, and then she goes into her menstruation. So it's kind of cool when you understand these loops in the process. Back in the 60s when they were figuring this out, they're like, hey, let's just try it and see what happens. If we give this woman progesterone for this long and then let go of it, what's going to happen? And they found that it made it so that she didn't release her own eggs. All right. So there's the progesterone being released here, progesterone released, and then if no fertilization happens by around day 21, her body says, I don't think it's going to happen. And then it just causes this to start shriveling up and get smaller and smaller. It doesn't shrivel up overnight. It takes a few days for it to shrivel up. So you can see she peaks with progesterone, and then it slowly starts tapering down. It doesn't just stop automatically. And then when her progesterone levels are lowest, that's when menstruation happens. We haven't talked about the uterus yet, but if you look at the uterine lining, look at how the hormones affect the uterine lining. These are the 2 hormones you have to watch for the uterine lining, not FSH and LH. It's the ovarian hormones. Estrogen, look at estrogen. As estrogen is rising, look at what happens to the lining of the uterus. It rises with it. And even as it starts spiking, the uterus gets thicker. As the uterus is developing, it's because of estrogen. It's growing new blood vessels. It's growing new little, exocrine glands that are releasing pheromones, releasing chemicals. It's storing sugar. Why would it be storing sugar and lots of blood? Just in case an egg that's fertilized comes along and implants here. It's going to feed that egg. The egg, remember, it's a shell. Can it get nutrients from outside while it's inside the shell? Does a chicken egg suck nutrients from the environment while it's in the egg? No. So this thing's been starving for days. Once it's released, it's floating along, and when it gets down into the uterus and it's ready to break free and get into the uterus, it's hungry. It's starving. So the woman's body's been priming and prepping, bringing all kinds of blood, nutrients, sugars, lots of glycogen stored up in the uterus. Right. Right? So as estrogen comes out, estrogen is responsible for the first 14 days of uterine thickening. After that, what hormone kicks in? Look at that little plateau right there. Day 14, there's a plateau. It's not getting any thicker. It's not getting any smaller either, but it's not getting thicker. And then suddenly, whoop, it starts growing again. What hormone does the second phase of growth? Progesterone. So progesterone thickens and thickens and thickens and makes us thicker, so it's primed for fertilized egg to implant. And then if the egg doesn't implant, there's no signal telling the body that, hey, we've got a baby in here. And then the lining starts sloughing off. All those blood vessels start breaking. They start trimming back down. All those sugars are released. And then what's happening to her during this time? She's going through menstruation. So like you said, watch this. This is really cool. I love this chart. I was about to say I'm kind of a visual learner, but I'm kind of every learner. I like reading the stuff. I like listening to lectures. I like watching videos. So whatever it takes to help you remember this. The first 14 days is primarily what hormone doing the growth here? Estrogen. The second, roughly 10 or 11 days, is what hormone? Progesterone. And I told you this the first day we talked about endocrine. I told you, what do you know about progesterone and estrogen? They were unique. We always think they agree with each other, but what does progesterone do? Does it work as a synergist with estrogen? Does it work as an antagonist with estrogen? Or does it work as a permissive hormone with estrogen? It's an antagonist. Estrogen also makes the uterine lining kind of cramp a little bit. It causes contraction of the uterine muscles. Why would progesterone stop estrogen from doing that in the second half of the cycle? If she's trying to get an egg to attach, do you want the uterus jiggling like jello? No. So why does progesterone stop estrogen? So that she doesn't have the contractions of the uterus. So it gives the fertilized egg a better chance of implanting. And then we haven't talked about pregnancy yet, but during pregnancy, progesterone stays high all the way through pregnancy. Why? To hold the embryo and the fetus in. Because if progesterone drops a month into pregnancy and estrogen starts making this quiver and shake, what could happen? A spontaneous abortion. Yeah, it could reject the baby. It could actually cause pinching, smashing, contractions of the embryo or the fetus. So progesterone stays high. All right, I'm going to go back and just finish this up. So when you're looking at the parts of the cycle, you can look at that page over next to you. And the first 14 days, you want to remember that the first 14 days is primarily what hormone is doing the control? Estrogen. So where it says the first half, you might want to write 7 days here because it's the first half of the first half. It's the 7 days. So the first 7 days, you're going to see increasing levels of FSH. And you saw that on that chart. FSH is kind of growing up a little bit. But around day 7, what happens to FSH? It kind of, it doesn't increase as fast anymore. It kind of like levels off or drops slightly. Okay. The cells in the follicle, the granulosa cells, those are the name of the cells, they're cranking out estrogen. The granulosa cells are more sensitive to LH than FSH. Granulosa cells are more sensitive to LH than FSH. They're making estrogen. What did LH do for the male? It helps him make testosterone. If you forgot, if you know LH is making estrogen here, it must be making what in a man? The equivalent, which would be testosterone. Don't make life any harder than it is. Just look at the male versus the female. We're extremely similar. You just change the name on most of our structures. Right? So estrogen levels are rising. Around day 7, the second half, the levels of estrogen are extremely high because it gets stuck in what kind of loop from day 7 to day roughly 13? A positive feedback loop. You're stuck in this positive feedback loop. So the second half, you have really high levels of estrogen. And this should actually say not increase, it should say decrease FSH. So it's a good thing you came to class and listened to the lecture, huh? Because look at it, the levels of estrogen as they go up. As estrogen is going up, what's happening to FSH? It's going down. Yeah, so it's kind of leveling off a little bit, and now it's starting to drop between day 7 and day 13. So you need to change that to decrease. And then the high level of estrogen around day 13 causes a surge. And I use that word, the hypothalamus kind of like blows a fuse. It has a surge and pops the fuse. The hypothalamus can't handle it, so the hypothalamus stimulates the release of LH and just floods the LH. Can it just release LH? If it releases GnRH, can it just release LH? Nope, it also releases FSH. So if you look at that chart again, look at what happens to FSH. It spikes too. It's not as high as the LH, but it still has a spike. And what does LH do? It causes ovulation. That's 5, just saying. So LH causes the ovulation. Ovulation is a split second in time. I didn't even use my mouth for that one. There's the pop. So the high spike, and then because of the LH spike, it stops estrogen. So estrogen synthesis drops, and you saw it plummet really quick. When LH comes out, it inhibits, it shuts off estrogen. Estrogen starts dropping. And the way you want to think of that is that that follicle, when it was just a follicle, it was releasing lots of estrogen. But now it's not a follicle. At ovulation, it changes names and becomes what? That big yellow fluffy cholesterol stuff, the corpus luteum. What's that producing? It's not producing tons of estrogen, it's producing a lot of progesterone. So don't forget, the first half of the cycle, the first 14 days are dominated by estrogen, the second 14 days are dominated by progesterone. Is there any estrogen in the second 14 days? Was there any estrogen in the second 14 days? Yes. There just never will be as much as there was in the first 14 days. Okay, so that high level of antral fluid, there's an enzyme that pops the wall of the balloon. The enzyme eats through the wall. If the enzyme's not there, remember the 14-pound follicle or 15-pound follicle? It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And basically at that point they call it an ovarian cyst. Anybody ever heard that term before? Yeah. Okay, so the follicle or the follicular cells start turning to luteal cells, and they're going to crank out progesterone. So this is where it stops at ovulation for the first 14 days. We call this whole phase, the first 14 days, the follicular phase. Because what are you developing in the first 14 days? The follicle. What are you developing in the second 14 days on the ovary? First 14 days it was called a follicle. The second 14 it's called the corpus luteum. So they call the second half of the cycle the luteal phase. It's dominated by the yellow body. It's no longer a follicle, now it's a yellow body. What's the hormone, the primary hormone during this phase? Progesterone. I feel like I'm beating this to death, but you really have to know it. The last test, again, it's basically an endocrine test, but it has reproductive stuff on it. Because reproduction is driven by what system? The endocrine system. It's all driven by the endocrine system. Hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary. If you don't have a working anterior pituitary or a working hypothalamus, reproduction doesn't happen. And I told you that before. Hypothalamus controls 4 things, right? Freezing, feeding, fighting, and fornicating. Sex, sorry, right. All right, so the luteal phase is the last 14. Right after the luteal phase, and technically it's the last 5 days of the luteal phase, you have something called the menstrual phase. But the menstrual phase is referring more to what organ is menstruating. It's not the ovary that's menstruating, it's the uterus. So if no fertilization happens, then you shift into the menstrual phase. That's if no fertilization happens, she shifts into the menstrual phase. So the luteal phase, you've got those 14 days after ovulation. She has roughly 7 or 8 days for that fertilized egg to implant into the wall. There's certain timelines you kind of have to remember. The egg itself only stays alive for 24 hours. That's it. If it's not fertilized, the egg dies. The sperm stays alive for about 48 to 72 hours on average. So what's that tell you? When she ovulates, is that a good time to start having sex? No. Because it's going to take the sperm about 2 days to get all the way up to meet with the egg. So before ovulation happens, if they want to have a more successful rate of getting pregnant, they have to have sex. They have sex and the sperm swimming up there for a few days, meeting up with the egg before that 24-hour deadline. It's like once it's released, a little hourglass flips over and she has 24 hours in that before it dies. All right? So that fertilization has to happen, but her body, her brain doesn't know fertilization happened because the fertilized egg is just floating out in the fallopian tubes. It's floating down into the uterus. something has to happen where it gets into her system and tells her system we're fertilized and we're implanted. So she has 7 to 8 days before that little fertilized egg can implant. If it doesn't get implanted within 7 or 8 days, she starts shifting into the menstrual cycle. Or, sorry, the menstrual phase. She starts softening the lining. At that point, when the lining's soft, if that egg is floating in there, it's just going to get mixed up with the debris and start leaving the body. Right. So watch what's going on with the ovaries and the hormones. But now we're going to shift over. During that 28 days, it's not just her ovaries that are changing. Does anything else about the woman's body change during her cycle? Like, everything changes during those 28 days. Everything. Attitude, perspective on life, everything. Water gain, protein development, everything about her changes during those 28 days. So what I've been focusing on here is all ovaries, on the hormones. But you have to look at all the other reproductive structures. When you look at the fallopian tubes during the follicular phase, the first 14 days, the fallopian tubes at the beginning are kind of thin, they're not doing much. But as they're getting ready for ovulation, it's almost like Santa's elves getting ready for Christmas. They're packing proteins in, they're starting to get everything ready, and then right at ovulation, all the cilia start going shh, and they move really quick. They get really active. So during the luteal phase, you watch the cilia, and they start beating like crazy. Why? Because ovulation triggered the beginning of luteal phase, and what are these cilia trying to do? They have 24 hours to take the egg and meet it up with the sperm. So they start going really, really crazy until towards the end of the luteal phase, and they slow back down again, and they get primed for the next cycle. So the fallopian tubes start changing their activity too. And then the vagina changes. So early at the beginning of the first 14 days, look at this. Here's that cycle again. Roughly the first 5 days here, you have high FSH, LH is rising, estrogen is really low, progesterone is really low. Look at the uterine lining. What's it doing? It's thinning. What's she doing for these 5 days? She's menstruating, yeah. So she's sloughing off the lining. And now as estrogen starts accumulating again, it starts thickening up. It's the same thing with the vaginal wall. During this bleeding phase, the vaginal lining actually gets thinned out. It's very narrow. As it gets closer to ovulation, it starts thickening up. Even the vaginal lining does that. So around ovulation, it's thicker, it has more sugars in it. Why would it have more sugars in the lining and the excretions around ovulation? To help feed the sperm. Right, remember the sperm comes into the vagina. So it's feeding the sperm. As the sperm's swimming up, another thing that happens right around day 14, back here, of the vagina, is the opening. What's the opening between the vagina and the uterus called? The cervix. For the first roughly 12 days of her cycle, there's been a thick, dense mucus. I was expecting somebody to finish it. A plug. Nobody's ever heard of the mucus plug? Why would it have a plug in there? Why would it be plugged for roughly the first 12 days of the first cycle? So that what can't get into the uterus? Guess what you have living in the vagina? Bacteria, yeast. So things like Candida albicans that cause the yeast infection can't get up and into the uterus. If this thing gets up into the uterus, it can actually go where? Is the uterus plugged? Is it a dead end? Nope. So if it goes up in the uterus, it can go up through what tubes? The fallopian tubes, are they plugged at the end? They're wide open. Where can it go from there? Into her abdominal cavity. So that thick plug, the cervical plug, is preventing bacteria from getting in. But why around day 12 would that plug start thinning? It gets more watery. So that sperm can get in. Right. Sperm's about the same size as bacteria. So around day 14, around the luteal phase, that plug actually breaks up and the sperm can swim through. And then at ovulation, around day 14, it thickens back up again. So when's the ideal time for, if they want to get pregnant, when's the ideal time? Wait till day 14? Nope. Around day 12 or day 13. Introducing the sperm while that cervical plug's its thinnest so it can swim up and through. Because at day 14, and it's got that thing has to have a turbo booster to get up into the fallopian tubes. Or something like that. Okay. And then the uterus itself, I've already talked about the uterus, but watch what's happening to the uterus. During the first 5 days, roughly, it's thinned, and then it starts plumping up again because of estrogen. Day 14, it switches from estrogen to what? Starts plumping it. Progesterone. So you see changes in the lining, the thickness of the lining. the muscle layer of the lining, the contents of the lining, the secretions of the lining, it all changes so that it's preparing for the egg to get there. Right, so the follicular phase, the first several days, it's thin. During the luteal phase, it gets thicker because of progesterone. It's secreting enzymes. It's trying to tell the fertilized egg, come this way, come this way, come this way. And then grab a hold of it, stick it, and then I'll show you what happens after it sticks to the lining. All right. So let's talk about just estrogen and progesterone. Here are the main effects of estrogen and progesterone. That should say progesterone. Gosh, me and my typos. So here you want to fix this too. Effects of estrogen and progesterone, not testosterone. And what stinks is I actually can't change this. After I made this, my computer crashed and I lost the original file. Boo. Okay, so the effects of estrogen at puberty. What's estrogen do to a girl at puberty? What's it do to her bones? Causes them to grow. Right, it's puberty. What happens to a girl at puberty? Whoop! Yeah, her puberty, she starts skyrocketing over all the boys in the class, right? Because they still have about how long before they hit puberty? About 2 years. Life's unfair. I don't know who said that, but okay. Anyway, so estrogen at puberty, it increases bone growth. And you know this because what do you think happens to estrogen production at menopause? It decreases dramatically because the follicle has been releasing it and she's not making follicles anymore. So her estrogen level plummet. What happens to her bone density around menopause? Plummets dramatically, exactly. That estrogen it's like testosterone, it's just estrogen. It helps and stimulate bone growth tall during puberty, and it helps stimulate bone growth density the rest of her life. Right? It helps her develop sex organs, so it helps develop breast tissue, helps kickstart, well, the ovaries. The ovaries are what's doing it. And then secondary sex characteristics too. And it's the lack of testosterone that keeps her from getting all the masculine characteristics. All right, and the metabolic effects of estrogen. So stimulates secretion of GnRH, LH, and FSH during part of the cycle, but it actually shuts it off during other parts of the cycle. And I already talked about this. During part of the cycle, it allows GH, RH, or LH, GH, LH, and FSH to work. But then for a while, it shuts it off, and it goes into a positive feedback loop where it actually tells the ovary, just go on your own. Forget the hypothalamus, forget the anti-pituitary, just keep cranking out on your own. Right, the second one, decreases sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. This is actually really important because what the peripheral tissues would be things like her muscles. Her estrogen is telling her muscles don't absorb what? It's decreasing the sensitivity to insulin, so it's turning off insulin receptors. What do insulin receptors normally make you do? Absorb sugar. It's telling her own muscles not to absorb the sugar. Why would estrogen be doing that? Think about it. Around day 14, day 7 to day 14, where are you wanting those sugars to be stored? Not in the muscles of your arms and your legs. You want the sugar stored in your uterus. Yep, so it's the peripheral tissues out here, your arms and your legs, are going to decrease their sensitivity to insulin, but the uterus is going to become more sensitive because of the insulin, or the estrogen, sorry. So the estrogen is going to tell the insulin receptors to point the sugar towards the uterus and start plumping the uterine lining like you see down here. It's storing a lot of sugar here so that when the egg gets implanted, if it gets implanted, it can start eating. Okay. Here's where it really starts sucking for you women. So estrogen increases the level of plasma proteins. In other words, she has more solutes in her blood. What's that make her retain? More water, which causes bloating, edema, swelling, puffiness. So the more estrogen is in her system, the more bloaty she gets, right? And then at around, well, here during menstruation, she doesn't have very much estrogen, so what happens to her water? She starts losing lots of water. In fact, she's losing lots of water, she's also losing lots of blood at the same time. Estrogen levels drop. And then the fourth one, increased circulating levels of renin. So while estrogen's out, estrogen's also releasing renin. Where did that come from? The kidney. What does renin make you do? It triggers the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system too. What's the final effect of renin's pathway? To make you raise your blood pressure by retaining water, retaining proteins, retaining salt, all those things. Squeezes your blood vessels, constricts your blood vessels. So not only do we have a bloaty woman, but we have one with high blood pressure and irritability. Thank you, estrogen. So estrogen has a lot of effects. And what's really interesting is think about this too. During menopause, well actually when estrogen comes out, what's it doing to all of our blood vessels? It's making them squeeze and open, squeeze and open. This increases the risk of blood vessels in the brain squeezing and opening, which causes what problem? Migraines. Estrogen has a huge impact on migraines. And then what you find is a lot of women that have migraines all through their life, when they hit menopause, what happens to their migraines? They start going away. But think about this. They get hot flashes. They get a little burst. As the ovaries finishes releasing estrogen, it like sputters. Like your car when it's dying because you're out of gas, it goes. So she gets these little bursts of estrogen. When she gets the burst of estrogen, her blood vessels go. They open up, and then they make her face turn red. Her body feels really hot, and she has that hot flash, and then it's gone. And then everything goes back to normal. So it's the estrogen sputtering that causes hot flash. It's the same idea as these. Right? And then number 5, protects against bone loss. So estrogen keeps her bones dense. And then at menopause, when this goes away, she doesn't have that. Then the effects of progesterone antagonizes the effects of both testosterone and dihydroxytestosterone. And what else should you put in here? It antagonizes what female hormone? Estrogen. Progesterone turns down all of her masculine characteristics, which actually kind of sucks because these masculinizing hormones gives her a sex drive. Why would she have decreased sex drive during this phase? Because the sex drive should have been back here, right? So her sex drive should have been right here before ovulation. After ovulation, she's like, forget it, you're useless. Right? Her testosterone and her DHEA is actually turned down. So her masculinizing hormones are turned down because of progesterone. And then number 2, promotes breast development. So progesterone, that's why breasts kind of swell a little bit during the second phase. Just in case pregnancy happens, then they're starting to prime. So they become more sensitive. And then the third one promotes salt and fluid retention. So just like estrogen, it's making her retain water and salt, bloaty factors. Right? And then strongly inhibits uterine contractions by blocking what hormone? Estrogen. So those are the main effects of each of those hormones. And then contraception, we already talked a little bit with the oral contraceptive. It's just high levels of progesterone and estrogen. It's trying to mimic this phase of her cycle. So when they give the dose, they try and make it look like this: a high level of progesterone and a lower level of estrogen. Because as long as she's taking a synthetic version of this, she's not making her own efficiently. So it's actually mimicking these drugs. Or hormones, sorry. She takes a drug that mimics the hormones. Right, and then there are long-lasting injections that slowly release the chemicals to keep telling your hypothalamus, don't turn on, don't turn on, don't turn on. And then the morning after pill is a huge dose of progesterone and estrogen. Basically what it does is it tricks her body. She spikes it really quick, and then it's just basically a one-dose thing. It plummets. When it plummets, her hypothalamus goes, whoa, everything's dropping. Maybe we should start getting ready for the next cycle. So what it does is it starts sloughing off the uterine lining. And then I hate this name. So I was in school when they came out with this drug, and it's called the RU486, and that's the abortion pill. And I hate this name because when I first thought it, I thought it was like one of those Onion jokes. Anybody know what the Onion radio network is? It's where they make up really stupid news headlines. And I thought this was a stupid news headline because if you've ever heard of 86ing something, it's to throw it away. So look at the name, RU4 throwing it away. RU486ing. So this is the abortion pill. They take this, and what it does is it's almost like having a surge of estrogen. It starts shaking in the uterus and causes the uterine lining to start contracting, and it's trying to reject the embryo. Because estrogen affects the same thing with the clotting factors, like platelet activating factor and stuff like that. Yeah. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh, like the implanted birth control pills, like the little, the IUDs. Most of those actually have a little copper strip in them because copper releases free radicals that will actually damage the sperm. So even if there is an implantation, it irritates the lining of the uterus so that everything's rejected right away. Should probably just put that in there. And then menopause, that's the end. About what age does this happen? Around 50, yeah. So 49, 50, 51, 52, somewhere in that. It's a little different for different women. But what they do know is that if your mom went into menopause early, what's probably going to happen to you? Same thing. Yeah. Okay, so prior to menopause, so perimenopause or premenopause, menstruation starts occurring less frequently, the number of follicles developing decreases, her level of estrogen decreases because the follicles were making that, and so everything starts dropping. What's interesting is if she's not making estrogen, what's her hypothalamus think? Low estrogen, what's the hypothalamus start thinking? Holy crap, we don't have enough estrogen, what should we do? Release GnRH, and GnRH causes what two hormones to get released? LH and FSH, right? Luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So right around menopause, to see if she's really in menopause, they can take a blood sample. What hormone will they see low? Estrogen. What hormones will they see high? FSH and LH. Yep, they spike, but they're not doing anything. There's no receptors because the follicle's not developing. So her FSH and LH are high, which tells them that's really in menopause. Okay, and then with low levels of estrogen, what happens to her bone density? Starts getting weaker. Her feminine characteristics start going down, so breast size actually starts decreasing around menopause. But she still has adrenal glands, so what sex hormones still being released? DHEA. So what's bad for her is what happens to her sex drive around menopause. Starts going up, actually. She gets masculine characteristics. She's acting like a man now, right? So she has a one-track mind. So the levels of DHEA go up and up and up, but the feminine characteristics start decreasing, like the vaginal secretions decrease. So breast size decreases, muscle tone can actually increase. What happens to her voice? A little bit deeper. She has to maybe shave a little bit more. Okay, and then the last section, so conception. Now we've talked about the girl hormones, we've talked about the boy hormones in the past, we talked about the structures in the pathway, and now what happens when the two meet. So conception, you basically have a 3-day window. It starts 2 days before ovulation and ends a day after ovulation. So ideally for perfect conception, intercourse happens at about day 12 of her cycle. The semen's injected into her, and then the sperm is swimming up and towards the fallopian tube. Where do you want fertilization to happen? I don't know if I have this in here. I mentioned it earlier. Where did fertilization happen along this pathway? In the fallopian tube. Yep. Down here in the ampulla, this area in the fallopian tube is where fertilization should actually happen. But where should pregnancy happen? In the uterus. Yep. So as you're floating this thing down along here, fertilization happens, but that fertilized egg is still a shell. There's no tail on it. The sperm's tail is not sitting out there propelling the egg. You just have this egg being carried down into the uterus. It's still developing inside. So this structure, this new organism, is actually developing inside the egg, just like a little chicken growing inside the egg. Right? So ideally, within 24 hours of ovulation, she should be fertilized. Because what happens if she's not fertilized within 24 hours? What happens to the egg? It dies. Yeah. There's a chemical reaction that happens when the sperm is introduced into the egg. The chemical reaction sustains life long enough for it to be implanted. So now this thing's developing. When the sperm swims up to it, it's not one sperm that actually does the work. One sperm gets into the egg, but it takes more than one sperm. It's a team effort. So you've got this little SWAT team moving in trying to penetrate the egg, right? And they're all releasing their enzymes from what part of the sperm? What's the little tip of the sperm, the A word? Acrosome. So it's releasing enzymes from the acrosome, and they're eating away out here on the outer edge. And this is the zona pellucida. It's like this liquidy shell around the outside of the egg. So all these sperm are working together, but it's the one that gets into the egg first that's the winner. All the other ones have to back off. They can't get in. So one sperm actually gets in and fertilizes the egg. It dumps its DNA in. This is kind of cool. The split second, like milliseconds, once it gets inside, it flips a trigger on the inside. So there are receptors inside the egg. And as soon as that acrosome breaks through, the sperm will flip the trigger, the receptor, and it actually makes this chain reaction where the entire outer shell turns into a calcium shell. It's like a chain reaction, and it's armorizing this egg so nothing else can get in. Why is that? Why do you not want any other sperm getting in? How many chromosomes do you want inside this fertilized egg? 46. If you have 2 sperm that get in, it's called polyspermy, and it's not compatible with life. It will always create a spontaneous abortion. Way too much DNA doesn't work. If you have any more than 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, it can't survive. And that's why I was saying, now they're thinking it's more like 1 in every 5 fertilizations actually result in a pregnancy, because it's really hard, technically, it's hard to get pregnant. Some people, easier than others, but it's hard for them to get pregnant because you have to only have 1 sperm get in. If 1 sperm gets in on this site at the same time as this one, that egg's doomed. It can't survive. So polyspermy is not compatible with life. Then this thing that can't swim has to actually bind to the wall of the uterus. If it doesn't manage to bind at the right time, it gets rejected. So there's a lot of things that go into that. If there are any flaws in the sperm's DNA, if there are any flaws with the egg's DNA, most of the time it's actually rejected. Right, so fertilization is when 1 egg meets with 1 sperm. And the ampulla is where fertilization should happen. And I kind of went through and bolded most of the most significant parts. I can't tell if ampulla is bolded, can you? It's not. You might want to underline it then. So many sperm degrade the outer barrier. So the zona pellucida around here, they're all breaking it down.
So how does twins happen?
Depends on what kind of twin. If she accidentally releases more than 1 egg, which, by the way, that infertility video I was just talking about with the fertility doctor, what was also interesting that I didn't know before is for fertility issues, when they give them certain drugs, it stops. That little weapon that I told you where 1 follicle is trying to kill all the other ones, they give them a chemical that blocks the ability for them to kill the others. So now she can release like a dozen eggs at one time. What's that tell you? She could have lots of babies at one time, right? She could have a litter at that situation. Like Octomom. But yeah, if the 2 ovaries aren't in sync and they both release an egg at the same time, they can be fertilized by 2 totally different sperm. What kind of twins are those? Fraternal twins. Yep. They're two kids that have totally different genetics. Their DNA is not the same at all because every sperm has its own DNA and every egg has its own combination of DNA. No 2 eggs that a woman releases ever will be the same. No 2 sperm a man releases will ever be the same either. So that's fraternal twins. And then I'll talk about the other set in just a few minutes. So anyway, so syngamy is when 1 egg comes in and then that whole outer shell becomes calciumized. So basically a calcium shell forms. So now it's really like a chicken egg. It's hard on the outside. All right, so the zona pellucida just becomes rock hard, so nothing else can get in. At this point, it becomes something called a zygote, and you have to know that. So the different phases of development. The first phase, once you have a fertilized egg, it's no longer an egg. It's called a zygote. A zygote is a brand new living organism. So you have this zygote, and then the zygote, all the cells inside the zygote will start replicating. So you go from this 1 big egg cell, and it will split in half in the inside. The shell on the outside stays exactly the same size, but the zygote inside starts forming cells. So you go from 1 large cell to now you have 2 cells in that space. And then it splits again, and you have 4 cells in that space. And it splits again, and you have 8 cells in the space. And then 16, and then 32, 64, 128. And it just keeps doing that over and over and over again. But the size of this shell doesn't change. It's like a chicken growing on the inside. So the shell is still floating, carried by the cilia down and into the uterus. So the first stage is called the zygote. As it gets a little bit thicker, it's actually called a morula. So when you get to about the 32 cells on the inside, it's still in the shell, it's called a morula. A morula is a mass of cells. It's just a big ball of cells in there. But it's still cramped and it's stuck. So all these cells, they're stuck inside and they're just cramped up in there. So then the morula starts dropping into the uterus, and hopefully, just like a baby chicken, what's it going to do? It should be able to squeeze and blast out of the egg. At the second that it starts blasting out of the egg, we call it a blastocyst. So it breaks the egg, just like a baby chicken. It busts out of the egg. It has to bust out of the egg in the uterus. If it doesn't bust out of the egg, it will just float down through the cervix and be lost out of the vaginal canal. So the blastocyst has to open here. So there's another thing that could happen. You could have a fertilized egg, but if it doesn't pop out of the shell, then it's lost. Right. The empty hollow core, once it bursts out, instead of it being a big ball, it actually starts forming a hollow core. It starts forming layers. So this hollow core in the middle is called a blastocele. And the other type of twin can happen anywhere in this like morula to blastocyst phase. If, let's say, you crack open the egg, but only one cell pops out, it lost connection with the other cells. Guess what that one cell can do? It's going to replicate. It's going to keep replicating, and it becomes a totally different organism. But now you have this other one that's going to replicate in another area. What do you know about the DNA in these two cells? They're exactly the same DNA. What kind of twins do you have? Identical twins. Yep, so monozygotic means they started as one zygote up here. They had the same DNA, they popped out, and then they became two organisms. Dizygotic means how many zygotes did you have? Two totally different ones. The DNA is different, so fraternal twins. So dizygotic is fraternal, monozygotic twins are identical. But it's not done yet, so it doesn't just automatically pop out and stick to the wall. It has to find its way over to the wall. And remember, this, if the woman's 30 years old right now and this thing popped out and is trying to stick to the wall of her uterus, what's her immune system going to think? It's an invader. This is not her. Its DNA is different than the mom. So when it starts attaching to the wall, this thing's going to release enzymes and it's going to start burrowing itself in just like a parasite. But she's going to love this parasite. And as this parasite grows over the next 9 months, it's going to keep making her belly bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's acting like a parasite. It releases enzymes. It's hungry. And what it's doing is trying to burrow down to reach her bloodstream, just like a parasite. Because what's in her blood? Food, nutrients. Yep, it has plenty of nutrients. It has oxygen. It has everything that thing's going to need to grow. So as it starts burrowing down and getting deeper and deeper and deeper, it's releasing these enzymes that are eating away at her uterine lining. It's also going to start releasing an enzyme that tells her immune system, stop. It's going to suppress her immune system in this area. That hormone is called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. I think it's down here. Yep, right here. Human chorionic gonadotropin. That gets released into this area and it goes into her blood and it circulates through her blood and then it gets urinated out, which makes it perfect for what? Pregnancy tests. Because once this thing is implanted, remember right before this it was a fertilized egg and became a zygote and then a morula and then a blastocyst, but now it's actually burrowing in and it's digging in, it's implanting for pregnancy. Once it gets down close enough to the blood vessels, that hormone gets into her blood, it goes through her system and she just pees it out. So if she pees on a stick, there are little chemicals on the stick that detect HCG, and if it's there, it changes colors. We call it the pregnancy hormone. Right? That hormone travels all through her blood and also goes back up to the hypothalamus and goes to the ovaries, and it tells the hypothalamus and the ovaries, guess what just happened? We have pregnancy. What's it going to tell the hypothalamus? It's going to say, start making a new egg. It's going to tell the hypothalamus, shut off. Don't release any more eggs because we have a pregnancy developing. What's it going to tell the ovary? Stop making progesterone or make more progesterone. What did progesterone do to her uterus? It made it thick and plump, right? So you want more progesterone now that you have a baby growing in it? Absolutely. So this hormone, HCG, goes back to the ovary and tells the ovary to do what to the corpus luteum? Get bigger. Start absorbing more, what? Cholesterol. Make more progesterone. So it's going to keep plumping this up for about 9 months. You want more and more and more progesterone to keep the uterine lining plump and thick and help it grow. So HCG kickstarts that whole thing. Right. So implantation, ideally it happens about 6 days after ovulation, but the deadline is about 7 to 8 days. If implantation hasn't happened in 7 to 8 days, the ovary goes, well, I guess there's no HCG. That means that nothing happened. What's going to happen to the corpus luteum if there's no implantation within 7 to 8 days? It shrivels up. What happens to her progesterone production? decreases, what happens to a uterine lining? It starts thinning. If progesterone pumps it and you don't have progesterone, it thins. And then that triggers menstruation. Okay, so let me make sure I cover everything that needed covered. Implantation 6 days after ovulation, I already said that. And then the blastocyst goes down in, starts releasing HCG. Oh, I didn't talk about the layers. So here we have the trophoblast as one layer, and the trophoblast is actually going to be the fetal side of the placenta. So this shell out here, the trophoblast, as it digs in, it's going to form the fetal side of the placenta. The uterine wall is going to develop the maternal side of the placenta. So the placenta is actually like two hands that come together, baby side, the trophoblast, and then the mother side. And what they do is they just overlap. But these two hands are wearing gloves. So do the two hands technically actually touch each other? Not technically. Why would that be important? Why would mom's hand that's full of mom's blood not want to actually dig into the baby's hand that's full of blood? Because if something bad gets in mom's blood, what would it automatically do? Go straight into the baby's blood. So there's a protective layer in between. That's why it grows from mom's side and baby's side. They grow over each other and they overlap, but the blood never actually exchanges because there's always that protective lining inside of there. So the trophoblast is what actually forms the placenta on the fetal side. This ball mass, the inner cell mass, makes the baby. So this is where the baby is actually developing. Or technically, what is it right now? Now that's digging in, it's gone from being a blastocyst and now it's actually called it's a little embryo. So once it starts digging in, it's just an embryo. Back when I was younger, there was a song called Just the Embryo. Anybody know that song? Oh man, Google it sometime. It's funny. It was actually based on a song called Just a Gigolo, but it was a funnier version. As if Just a Gigolo wasn't funny. Come on, that was hilarious. Anyway, so HCG is that, we call it the pregnancy hormone because it tells us when we're pregnant. Tells her when she's pregnant, whatever. All right, and then gastrulation. So now you had that inner cell mass. Remember, what was the inner cell mass going to become? The placenta layer, or will it become the baby? It's the baby. So gastrulation is when that little inner cell mass starts creating its own layer. So it's starting to create layer after layer after layer. The water pocket that surrounds that is going to be called the amniotic cavity. It's going to be filled with amniotic fluid. But the three layers you need to know that the cell mass is becoming are the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. The ectoderm is the outer layer, the endoderm is the inner layer, and the meso is the middle layer. The significance of each of these layers, they become different organ systems. What's interesting about the ectoderm is I always think of the skin. That's our outside part, right? So the ectoderm forms our skin. But what is your skin full of that helps you sense your environment? Nerves. It's full of nerves. So the ectoderm actually becomes the nervous system and the skin. And then if you remember the pituitary gland, remember, that's nervous tissue. It's actually technically which part of the pituitary gland? Anterior or posterior? Well, actually, it's going to be kind of both. But what's the nervous side going to form? The posterior, and then the anterior is going to be made from skin cells, which is the, anterior side. And then the endoderm is everything on the very inside that has access to the outside. Do you have access to the outside through your GI tract? Yes. How about your lungs? Yes, through your nose. How about your reproductive tract? Yes. How about your urinary tract? Yes, all of those have access to the outside. So if it has access to the outside but it's inside of you, it came from the endoderm. Digestion, respiratory, urinary, reproductive. Everything that's inside of you that doesn't have exposure to the outside and should never have exposure to the outside is the mesoderm. Cardiovascular. Should your blood ever really be exposed to the outside? Not unless there's a problem. So your heart, your blood, so your cardiovascular, your muscles themselves, you should never have outside muscles or exposure, otherwise you've had damage. So that's how I remember these different layers. Endocrine, never direct outside. If endocrine had exposure to the outside, what would we actually call it? Exocrine. Yeah, it'd be a totally different system. So cardiovascular, endocrine, skeletal muscle, actually all muscle, and then the skeletal system. Those are the three primary layers. And that process is called gastrulation when you form the different layers. So you're growing and growing, you're forming those three layers, you've got the amniotic sac around it, it's growing, developing, bulging out of the placental wall, or placental wall, the uterine wall. And then as it's growing, again, you can see those different layers. Here's the placenta side for the baby. Here's the placenta side for mom. You can see mom's blood vessels go into it. Baby's blood vessels go into it, but they don't overlap. Look at mom's. It's separated from baby's. You have simple squamous, really thin cells that separate the two. What's the benefit of having simple squamous cells? What was the benefit of having capillaries that were simple squamous? Fast diffusion. What was the benefit of having alveoli that were simple squamous? Fast diffusion. Why do you want simple squamous here in the placenta? So that nutrients from mom can quickly diffuse over to baby. And then baby's blood carries up and in. So baby actually has 3 major blood vessels going in through the umbilical cord. Which one carries oxygenated blood? Arteries or veins? Veins. Yep, so the vein in the umbilical cord is actually what's carrying oxygenated blood to the baby. All right, so gastrulation developing. Now we're going to shift up to month 3. So we're shifting into the second trimester. The placenta is developed. And this month 3 is kind of a significant month because up until now, what organ in mom's body has been making all of her reproductive hormones, like the important ones, to develop the uterine lining? The ovary has been. So you've got this big corpus luteum on top of the ovary that's making progesterone and estrogen. But by month 3, the placenta is big enough, and the placenta becomes a totally separate organ. The placenta is going to take over. The placenta is going to start making progesterone and estrogen, and it's going to tell the hypothalamus and the ovary to do what? Stop. I got this. So the placenta takes over around month 3, and it starts making its own hormones to adjust baby and mom's body. So here are all the functions you have to know about the placenta. First, it forms a barrier. It's non-selective to things that love what? Water or fat? Guess. Fat. Anything that loves fat can penetrate or move across into the baby. Like alcohol loves fat. What kind of hormones will easily penetrate back and forth? Protein peptides, amines, or steroids? Steroids. Any kind of drug that loves fats, like morphine, heroin, fat-loving drugs go right into the baby. Alcohol goes right into the baby. Water-loving things don't go right into the baby. All right, so I think I got them here. Alcohol, steroids, narcotics, and anesthetics. So anesthetics, primarily when you're gases can go anywhere they want. So like laughing gas can get into mom's blood and go right across and into the placenta. Number 2, it transfers gases, so it acts like a respiratory system because baby's lungs aren't working, so the placenta does the work. It pulls oxygen out of mom's blood and pulls it over. When we were talking about the cardiovascular system, I talked about DPG, 2,3-diphosphoglycerate. That's high in the placenta, and that would shift the curve, if you remember back when we talked about it, it shifts the curve to the right to pull more oxygen off the blood. Why would you want to pull more oxygen off the blood right here? Because you have to get the oxygen over to the baby. So it actually takes more of mom's oxygen. The placenta does. Number 3, transport and storage of nutrients, so it acts like a digestive tract for baby. All the nutrients are digested. You just bring over the amino acids, you bring over the triglycerides, you bring over the sugars, give them right to the baby. That's why what in mom is bad, because the baby starts absorbing tons of sugar quickly. Gestational diabetes. Because there's all that sugar in mom's blood, and as you put more sugar to the placenta, it just starts pulling it indiscriminately, just pulling it across and giving it to the baby. What happens to the baby as a result? It gets fatter and fatter because it takes that sugar and turns it into fat, and it gets bigger. So what's the problem with gestational diabetes? Is that gigantic, ginormous babies. Not babies the size of Volkswagens, like a semi-tractor trailer, right? I wonder if they make that noise that as they're coming out. Number 3, so transport and storage of nutrients. I already said that. Number 4, excretion of waste. What organ does it act like when it's excreting waste? The baby's metabolizing things inside of there, making waste products. It's making urea. It's making nitrates. It's making all kinds of things that its body wants to get rid of. So what's the placenta acting like now? Kidneys. It's acting like kidneys. So it's one organ that has the function of lots of organs. And then number 5, hormone production. So it's actually acting as an endocrine organ, and these are the hormones you have to know. These are all secreted by the placenta. And right around what month did they start cranking out? Around month 3. So you see the placenta start taking over production of most of these hormones for mom. And the first one are going to be estrogen and progesterone. Up till now, the ovary's been doing it, but about month 3, the ovaries stop. The corpus luteum shrivels up into that corpus albicans, and mom's body's not making estrogen. So right at birth, what do you think is going on with mom's estrogen levels right at birth? Baby's gone, placenta's gone. Does it start making miraculously estrogen immediately? Steroid hormones take time to build up. So it's going to take her a little bit of time, so her estrogen levels will plummet. Her progesterone levels plummet. Her dopamine levels actually plummet too. Because of prolactin inhibiting hormone, dopamine is off. It's turned off so she can release prolactin. All right, next, HCG. So it's still making HCG. Originally it was the embryo that was making, and now the placenta is doing it. So HCG acts like LH, luteinizing hormone, and it blocks menstruation. Next one, this one deserves a big star, HCS, human chorionic somatomammotrophin. Big word, this is what causes gestational diabetes. It's this hormone. This hormone blocks insulin in mom's body. When insulin doesn't work in your body, what disease do you have? Diabetes mellitus, right? It mimics diabetes mellitus. This HCS blocks mom's insulin so that mom can't absorb sugar in her muscle and liver very efficiently. Why would it want to do that? Because it wants to keep her blood sugar a little bit higher, so it goes where? To the placenta, so that it goes where? Into the baby. So the placenta is releasing this chemical to stop mom's insulin so that the sugar is available for the placenta to pull it into the baby. It's HCS. So it's enhancing growth in the baby primarily. Relaxin actually cranks out right before birth. It relaxes the pubic symphysis so that what can happen? Where's the pubic symphysis? It's at the front of the pubic bones. It's that little piece of hyaline cartilage, and then relaxin comes out to help pivot the front of the pubic bones. So it helps open up the birth canal. So later towards the end of pregnancy it starts coming out, and then right before birth it starts cranking out because she's going to be driving that semi-trailer out of there. And then the next one, placental PTHRP. The RP stands for related protein. It means it looks like another hormone in mom's body. What's it look like? I'll give you a hint. Look at the first 3 letters. It looks just like parathyroid hormone. What does parathyroid hormone do in your body? It's responsible for doing what to calcium? Lowering your blood calcium or raising your blood calcium? Raising the blood calcium. So it's placental PTH is raising mom's blood calcium. Why would it want to be pulling calcium out of mom's bones and pulling it from her GI tract and raising it in her blood? Because it wants the calcium to go to the placenta to do what? Be transported over to the baby. It's trying to build cartilage and bone for the baby. So placental PTHRP, related protein, is trying to raise mom's blood calcium so that she absorbs more and brings it over into the baby. And then I already mentioned the umbilical cord, but the umbilical cord is the vascular connection, so it actually acts kind of like a cardiovascular system for the baby. 2 arteries, 1 vein, and the vein's what's carrying oxygen in the blood. And then the last part, pretty simple. So gestation is technically 38 weeks, but when you go to the doctor, if you're pregnant, they measure out how far? 40. Why 40? If the baby's only developing for 38, why do they measure 40? Because what are they actually measuring from? The last day of the last period, which is the first day of her cycle. Ovulation doesn't happen for 2 weeks after the first day of the cycle. So they add 2 more weeks in. So ovulation, fertilization, all happens, and then 38 days from ovulation is when or fertilization is actually when birth happens. Yep. So it's 40 days from the last menstrual period, but 38 days is the length of the gestational period, the true gestational period. And the first trimester, I already talked about this, starts out as a zygote, morula, blastocyst, and it's implanted. Once implanted, it's an embryo. And then after that, what do we call it? So about 2 months in to 3 months in, we start calling it a fetus. And then if you watch the video actually goes through all the development. About the last trimester, all the organs are there. So roughly 8 weeks in, all the organs are there. The last trimester, all the organs are there. What's the baby primarily absorbing? Fat. Why? Why is it absorbing mostly fat? Because it's trying to develop the nervous system. What substance in the nervous system is it really cranking out? Myelin sheath. Yeah, it's trying to make lots of myelin sheath. When a baby's born, there's not a lot of myelin sheath. There are lots of neurons, but not a ton of myelin sheath. And especially in the spinal cord. That's why it doesn't have control of usually its lower part of its body, like urination and defecation. And then at week 40, after the first day of the last period, is parturition. This is when mom and baby part ways, parturition. And then what happens is, there's still a lot of mystery in what happens, but the placenta is going to start releasing something called CRH, which looks just like mom's CRH, which came from the hypothalamus. This is called corticotropin-releasing hormone. So the placenta releases this. It's going down, and it's stimulating ACTH. ACTH releases cortisol, which is the what hormone? Stress hormone, and also DHEA, which is the masculinizing hormone, the androgen. This is happening in the baby. So the baby starting to release cortisol. Cortisol helps stimulate the lungs to start developing because it's about to take a breath pretty soon. But this DHEA and the cortisol also kind of seep over, and the DHEA will start becoming estrogen and getting into mom's blood. What does estrogen do to the uterus? Contracts. So estrogen's going, when the DHEA is converted to estrogen, it's going to start making small contractions in the uterus. So she starts feeling those Hickson-Brax contractions, that uncomfortable feeling. And when it becomes big enough, a signal is going to come all the way up to the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus what? Release the oxytocin. Yeah. So oxytocin is supposed to make her feel more comforted, a little bit better, but unfortunately oxytocin goes to the uterus and does what to it? Stimulates uterine contractions, which sends another signal up to the hypothalamus and tells it, oh, that sucked, release a little more oxytocin. And then it stimulates uterine contractions. Same signal. What loop did she just fall into? Positive feedback loop. And that keeps going over and over and over because of oxytocin now. It all started because of CRH, we believe it all started because of CRH in the placenta. It goes to activate cortisol and DHEA, and then the DHEA turns into estrogen, causes uterine contractions, triggers oxytocin, and oxytocin is the big positive feedback loop. Right. So while the hypothalamus is releasing oxytocin, it's also going to start releasing prolactin. What do oxytocin and prolactin help her do? Prolactin makes her start developing milk. Oxytocin lets her do what with the milk? Release it. Prolactin produces milk, oxytocin releases it. If she doesn't have oxytocin, what happens to the milk? She becomes engorged, right? It's not released. So she needs both of them. And what's interesting is that as long as she keeps releasing prolactin and oxytocin on a steady basis, roughly about every 2 to 2.5 hours, somewhere in that time, the hypothalamus keeps thinking, well, we're releasing prolactin and oxytocin, let's just not release gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Because it's telling her that she's feeding a baby, she's producing milk, she's feeding a baby. Does she want to be feeding 2 babies at one time? No, if she's feeding a baby now, she doesn't want to start feeding another baby 9 months later. She wants to keep taking care of this baby until it's done. And that's just the way humans are. We don't have litters. We have one baby, we focus on that, and then we raise it until we can safely create another baby. So this is kind of cool. How many people have heard that as long as you're breastfeeding, it's like being on the birth control pill? It's true to an extent. If she keeps feeding regularly about every 2 to 2.5 hours and keeps her prolactin levels high, it acts like a contraceptive. But what if she sleeps through the night? Or what if she sleeps for 4 or 5 hours? What happens to her prolactin levels? They start dropping, which means she starts producing less milk. What's the hypothalamus going to think? What the hell? Let's have another baby. And if she sleeps through the night, then it's like missing the birth control pill. What can happen? It starts releasing GnRH, LH, FSH, and she starts developing another follicle. So here's my chance to be a pig. The last 2 minutes of the semester is that's why the mom should stay up and take care of the baby at the night, and the man should sleep. Right? It acts like a contraceptive. Right? And then you can read through the last thing. Colostrum is the first substance that comes out. And colostrum really high in antibodies, and it starts changing later with as we start developing. Did I run out of time? I did. I ran over by 1 minute. Damn it! I was so close.
Okay, so I have one more question. I'll
Sure.
stop driving.